First story, The Campino's Forest Mystery, Poland, 2008. I never thought I'd be sharing this story, but I can't keep it bottled up anymore. It's been eating away at me for years, and I need to get it out there even if no one believes me. It happened back in 2008, during what was supposed to be a fun camping trip with my friends in the Polish wilderness. We were a group of 5, me, Marek, Anya, Tomek, and Karolina, all in our early 20s and looking for a weekend escape from our mundane lives in Warsaw. We'd chosen a spot deep in the Campino's forest, known for its dense pine woods and secluded clearings. The first day had gone perfectly. We'd hiked, set up camp, and spent the evening around the fire, sharing stories and drinking beer. As night fell, the forest came alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine needles and wood smoke. It was exactly the kind of peaceful retreat we'd been hoping for. None of us could have imagined how quickly that peace would be shattered, or the terrifying events that would unfold in the darkness of those woods. I remember looking up at the star-filled sky, marveling at how many more were visible out here, away from the city lights. If only I'd known then that something far stranger than stars was about to make its presence known. It must have been around midnight when we first noticed the lights. We were sitting around the dying embers of our campfire, getting ready to turn in for the night, when Anya suddenly pointed towards the trees. "Look," she whispered, her voice tinged with curiosity and a hint of unease. At first I didn't see anything, but then I caught a glimpse of movement. A faint, bluish glow weaving between the trunks about 100 yards away. My initial thought was that it must be other hikers, maybe lost and using flashlights to find their way. But as we watched, transfixed, it became clear that these weren't ordinary lights. They moved too smoothly, too purposefully, gliding through the forest without the bobbing motion you'd expect from someone walking. And the color was off. Not the warm yellow of a flashlight, but a cold, almost metallic blue that seemed to pulse and shimmer. We all fell silent, our earlier laughter and chatter replaced by a growing sense of unease. The lights were moving closer, weaving an intricate pattern through the trees that seemed almost intelligent. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, a primal instinct telling me that something was very, very wrong. Tomek, always the skeptic, tried to rationalize it. "It's probably just some kind of bioluminescent fungus," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. We all knew deep down that this was something else entirely. As we watched, frozen in a mix of fascination and fear, the forest around us began to change. It's hard to describe, but it was as if all the ambient noise, the rustling leaves, the nighttime insects, even the gentle breeze, just stopped. One moment we were surrounded by the usual nighttime symphony of the woods, and the next we were enveloped in a silence so profound it was almost tangible. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It felt heavy, oppressive, like it was pressing down on us from all sides. I remember trying to swallow and finding my mouth bone dry, my heart pounding so loudly in my chest that I was sure the others must be able to hear it. The lights were closer now, no more than 50 yards away, and we could see that they weren't just random patterns. They moved with a purpose, circling our campsite in an ever-tightening spiral. I wanted to run, to grab our things and flee back to the safety of civilization, but my body wouldn't respond. It was like I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot by a combination of fear and some other force I couldn't understand. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Karolina reach for Marek's hand. her knuckles white with tension. Anya had her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as if trying to make herself as small as possible. And Tomek, for all his earlier skepticism, was as pale as a ghost, his eyes wide with disbelief and terror. None of us spoke. What could we possibly say in the face of something so utterly beyond our understanding? The moment that seared into my memory, the instant when everything changed, came without warning. 1 second we were watching those eerie, blue lights dance through the trees, and the next, the entire clearing was bathed in a blinding white light. It wasn't like sunlight, or even the harsh glare of stadium floodlights. This was something altogether different. It was painfully bright, but at the same time, it seemed to have depth and texture, almost like it was alive. The beam shot down from directly above us, hitting the ground just a few feet from where we sat. The impact was silent, but I swear I could feel it in my bones, a deep vibration that set my teeth on edge. The air crackled with electricity, and I could taste something metallic on my tongue. In that moment I forgot about my friends, about the strange lights in the forest. All I could focus on was that pillar of light and the overwhelming sense that something immense and unknowable had turned its attention on us. I tried to shield my eyes to look away, but I couldn't. It was like the light was boring into my skull, bypassing my eyes entirely and searing itself directly into my brain. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped, helpless, as the light grew brighter and brighter until it consumed everything. What happened next is difficult to describe. My memories are fragmented, like shards of a broken mirror, each piece reflecting a different nightmare. I remember a sensation of weightlessness, of being lifted off the ground by an unseen force. The world around me seemed to warp and twist, the trees bending at impossible angles, the stars in the sky swirling into spirals. There was a sound, too, a low, pulsing hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It vibrated through my entire body, drowning out even the frantic beating of my own heart. I caught glimpses of my friends, their faces contorted in silent screams, their bodies suspended in midair just like mine. But it was like looking at them through frosted glass. Everything was blurry, distorted. Then suddenly, they were gone, blinked out of existence as if they'd never been there at all. I was alone, floating in a sea of that strange, living light. Time lost all meaning. I couldn't tell if seconds were passing or hours or days. My mind struggled to make sense of what was happening, grasping for any shred of normalcy, any explanation that could fit this into the world I knew. But there was nothing familiar here, nothing I could anchor myself to. I felt my consciousness beginning to slip away, overwhelmed by the sheer impossibility of it all. Just before everything went dark, I had one last terrifying thought. This isn't happening on Earth. I came to with a jolt, gasping for air like a drowning man breaking the surface. For a moment I was completely disoriented, my mind reeling, as it tried to process where I was and what had happened. Gradually, reality began to reassert itself. I was in my tent, zipped up in my sleeping bag, surrounded by the familiar sounds of my friend's soft breathing. Weak morning light filtered through the fabric of the tent, casting everything in a pale, ghostly glow. My first thought was one of overwhelming relief. It had all been a dream, a vivid nightmare brought on by too many campfire stories and my overactive imagination. But as I became more awake, that relief quickly turned to confusion and then to a creeping sense of dread. Something was wrong, very wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, but as I lay there trying to calm my racing heart, the discrepancies began to pile up. My clothes felt strange, twisted and bunched up in odd places. When I finally worked up the courage to look down at myself, I realized with a shock that everything I was wearing was on backward. My t-shirt, my jeans, even my underwear, all reversed, as if I'd gotten dressed in complete darkness or as if someone else had dressed me. My boots, which I distinctly remembered placing neatly by the tent entrance, were nowhere to be seen. And then there was the pain. A dull, throbbing ache in my arms that I couldn't explain. With trembling hands, I pushed up my sleeves and felt my breath catch in my throat. There, stark against my pale skin, were a series of small, perfectly round puncture marks, each surrounded by a bruise that was already turning a sickly yellow-green. I must have made some kind of noise, a gasp or a whimper, because suddenly my friends were stirring. Marek was the first to sit up, rubbing his eyes and looking at me with a mixture of concern and confusion. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice still thick with sleep. I opened my mouth to answer, but where could I even begin? How could I explain what I'd seen, what I'd experienced, when I barely understood it myself? As the others began to wake up, I found myself bombarded with questions. They all looked at me strangely, a mix of worry and something else. Suspicion, maybe, or disbelief. Anya was the one who finally said what they were all thinking. "You've been here all night, Piotr. We all went to sleep at the same time, remember?" But I didn't remember. The last thing in my mind was that blinding light, that sensation of floating. I tried to explain, my words tumbling out in a frantic, disjointed mess. I told them about the lights in the forest, the unnatural silence, the beam from the sky. With each word, their expressions grew more skeptical, more concerned. Tomek even reached out to feel my forehead, as if checking for a fever. "You must have had a really intense dream," Karolina said gently, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. They didn't believe me. How could they? It sounded insane even to my own ears. As the morning wore on, my frustration and fear only grew. My friends tried to act normally, breaking down the camp and preparing for the hike back, but I could feel their sidelong glances, could hear the whispered conversations when they thought I wasn't listening. They were worried about me, that much was clear. But there was an undercurrent of unease that went beyond simple concern for my mental state. I caught Marek and Anya having a heated discussion, their voices low but intense. "We can't just ignore this," Anya was saying. "What if he's having some kind of breakdown?" Marek's response chilled me to the bone. "Or what if he did something last night? Sleepwalking, maybe. We need to make sure everyone's okay, that nothing's missing." The implication was clear. They thought I might have done something while they slept. Something to explain my strange state and backward clothes. Part of me wanted to be angry at their mistrust, but another part understood. If our roles were reversed, wouldn't I be just as suspicious? As we packed up, I noticed other small details that only added to my growing sense of wrongness. The ground around our campsite was undisturbed. No signs of the scorching I'd expect from that intense beam of light. My missing boots were found, neatly placed outside my tent, despite my clear memory of leaving them inside. And strangest of all, when I checked my watch, it showed that nearly 6 hours had passed from when we'd first seen the lights to when I woke up. 6 hours that were a complete blank in my mind. The hike back to civilization was a tense, uncomfortable affair. My friends tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, chatting about mundane things and making plans for future outings, but there was an underlying current of unease that couldn't be ignored. I caught them exchanging worried glances when they thought I wasn't looking, their conversations dropping to whispers as I approached. I felt isolated, cut off from the easy camaraderie we'd shared just a day before. The forest, which had seemed so welcoming and peaceful on our way in, now felt oppressive and alien. Every shadow held potential threats. Every rustle in the undergrowth made me flinch. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that whatever had happened last night wasn't over. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the fragments of memory I had, searching for some rational explanation that could put everything into perspective. But no matter how I approached it, I kept coming back to the same terrifying conclusion. Something had taken me last night, something not of this world. The puncture marks on my arms throbbed, a constant reminder that this wasn't just in my head. As we neared the edge of the forest, I made a decision. I couldn't just let this go, couldn't pretend it never happened. I needed answers, even if it meant risking my friendships, my reputation, maybe even my sanity. In the weeks that followed our return from the forest, my life began to unravel. I couldn't sleep, plagued by nightmares of blinding lights and sensations of weightlessness. When I did manage to drift off, I'd often wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, convinced I could hear that low, pulsing hum just on the edge of my hearing. My work suffered as I struggled to concentrate, my mind constantly drifting back to that night. I became obsessed with finding answers, spending hours online researching UFO sightings and alien abduction stories. The more I read, the more convinced I became that what had happened to me was real. The details in other people's accounts, the lost time, the strange marks, the feeling of being watched, they all resonated with my experience. But my friends and family weren't as understanding. They'd been supportive at first, listening to my story with concern and offering comfort. But as days turned to weeks and I couldn't let it go, their patience began to wear thin. Anya suggested I see a therapist, her voice gentle but her eyes filled with worry. Tomek, always the pragmatist, tried to convince me it had all been a vivid dream brought on by stress. Even Marek, my oldest friend, started to distance himself, making excuses to avoid our usual meetups. I could see the fear in their eyes when they looked at me. Not fear of what I'd experienced, but fear for my mental state. It was about a month after the incident when things took an even stranger turn. I was at home, poring over yet another online forum dedicated to alien encounters, when I noticed something odd. The lights in my apartment seemed to flicker, just for a moment, and that familiar metallic taste filled my mouth. My heart began to race as a low, almost subsonic hum filled the air. It was happening again. I scrambled to my feet, knocking over my chair in my haste. Should I run? Hide? Try to document what was happening? Before I could decide, my vision began to blur, the edges of the room seeming to warp and twist. The hum grew louder, drowning out the sound of my own panicked breathing. I felt that same sensation of weightlessness, my feet leaving the floor as an unseen force lifted me into the air. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The world around me dissolved into a swirling vortex of light and color, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. I found myself standing in my kitchen, trembling and drenched in sweat. The clock on the microwave showed that only minutes had passed, but my body felt like I'd run a marathon. As I struggled to catch my breath and make sense of what had just happened, I noticed something clutched in my hand, a small metallic object I'd never seen before. It was smooth and cool to the touch, with strange, swirling patterns etched into its surface. I had no idea where it had come from or what it meant, but one thing was clear. This was proof. Proof that I wasn't crazy, that something truly inexplicable was happening to me. The discovery of the object marked a turning point. I now had tangible evidence that something extraordinary was occurring, something that couldn't be explained away as dreams or delusions. But instead of providing relief, it only deepened my sense of isolation and fear. I was terrified to be alone, convinced that at any moment I might be taken again. Sleep became almost impossible. I'd jolt awake at the slightest sound, my eyes scanning the darkness for signs of those eerie lights. During the day, I felt like I was living in a fog, going through the motions of my daily life, while my mind remained fixated on the mystery that had consumed me. I tried to show the object to my friends, hoping it would convince them of the truth of my experiences. Their reactions were mixed. Anya recoiled from it, refusing to even touch it. Tomek examined it with skeptical interest, suggesting it might be some kind of obscure industrial component I'd picked up somewhere and forgotten about. Marek, to my surprise, seemed genuinely intrigued. He was the only one who didn't immediately try to rationalize it away. "I don't know what this is," he admitted, turning the object over in his hands. "But I've never seen anything quite like it." His words gave me a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I wasn't entirely alone in this after all. As weeks turned into months, my obsession with understanding what had happened to me only grew stronger. I threw myself into research, spending every spare moment reading about UFO sightings, alien abduction theories, and unexplained phenomena. I joined online communities dedicated to these topics, sharing my story and connecting with others who claimed to have had similar experiences. Some of their accounts were eerily similar to mine: the lights, the lost time, the inexplicable physical evidence. It was both comforting and terrifying to know I wasn't alone, but the more I delved into this world, the more isolated I became from my old life. My friends gradually stopped calling. My family's concerned inquiries became less frequent. I lost my job due to my increasingly erratic behavior and inability to focus on anything but my quest for answers. The strange object I'd found became my most prized possession. I spent hours examining it, trying to decipher the swirling patterns on its surface. Sometimes, late at night when the house was quiet, I swore I could feel it vibrating slightly, as if reacting to some unseen energy. I began to have vivid, fragmented flashbacks. Brief glimpses of sterile white rooms, of towering shadowy figures with impossibly large eyes, of gleaming instruments that filled me with instinctive dread. Were these repressed memories finally surfacing, or was my mind creating false recollections to fill in the blanks? I couldn't be sure, and the uncertainty gnawed at me relentlessly. It was during one of my late-night research sessions, about 6 months after the initial incident, that I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. I was browsing a Polish forum dedicated to paranormal experiences when I came across a post that caught my eye. It was from someone claiming to have been camping in the Campinos forest around the same time as my experience. They described seeing strange lights in the woods and experiencing a period of missing time. But it was the next part of their account that really shook me. They mentioned waking up with their clothes on backward and small, unexplained puncture marks on their arms. The details were too specific, too similar to my own experience to be a coincidence. With trembling hands, I reached out to the poster, desperate to connect with someone who might understand what I'd been through. Over the next few weeks, we exchanged numerous messages. Their name was Alexandra, and as we shared our stories, the similarities became even more apparent. We had both experienced that oppressive silence, the sensation of weightlessness, the metallic taste in our mouths. Alexandra had also been struggling to come to terms with what had happened, facing disbelief and concern from friends and family. But unlike me, they hadn't found any strange objects afterward. As we continued to communicate, a plan began to form. We decided to meet up to return to the Campinos forest together. Maybe, we thought, if we could find the exact spot where it had happened, we might discover some clue, some evidence that could validate our experiences. The day of our planned expedition to the forest dawned cold and overcast, a fitting atmosphere for the surreal task ahead. I met Alexandra at a small cafe on the outskirts of Warsaw. Despite having never seen each other before, I recognized her immediately. There was a haunted look in her eyes that I knew all too well, the look of someone who had glimpsed something beyond the boundaries of ordinary reality. As we drove towards Campinos, we shared more details of our experiences, each revelation strengthening our resolve to uncover the truth. The forest seemed different this time, more ominous. The trees loomed over us, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, and every shadow held the potential for hidden watchers. We hiked for hours, trying to retrace the steps that had led to our respective encounters. The strange object I'd found was tucked safely in my pocket, a constant reminder of why we were here. As the day wore on and we found nothing out of the ordinary, I could sense Alexandra's growing frustration. "Maybe we're wasting our time," she said, her voice tinged with disappointment. "Maybe we'll never know what really happened to us." I was about to agree when suddenly that now familiar metallic taste filled my mouth. The air around us seemed to thicken, and an unnatural silence fell over the forest. Alexandra's eyes widened in recognition and fear. "It's happening again," she whispered. Before I could respond, a beam of brilliant white light shot down from the sky, enveloping us both. The last thing I remember is reaching out to grab Alexandra's hand as the world around us dissolved into that swirling vortex of light and color. I woke up alone in my apartment, my head pounding and my mind reeling. The clock showed that 3 days had passed, but I had no memory of how I'd gotten home or what had transpired in the forest. Frantic, I tried to contact Alexandra, but all my messages went unanswered. Her profile on the forum where we'd first connected had been deleted as if she'd never existed. I was left with nothing but questions and a gnawing fear that something terrible had happened. In the weeks that followed, I struggled to piece together what had occurred. My clothes had once again been on backward, and new puncture marks adorned my arms. But this time, there was something else. A small, intricate symbol seemingly etched into my skin just below my left collarbone. It looked almost like a cross between ancient hieroglyphics and complex mathematical equations. I couldn't begin to decipher its meaning, but its presence filled me with a mix of dread and strange anticipation. The object I'd found months ago was gone, vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. In its place, I found a small, smooth stone with similar swirling patterns. When I hold it, I sometimes catch fleeting images in my mind. Vast, starlit skies, unlike anything on Earth, impossibly advanced technology and beings that defy description. I don't know what happened to Alexandra, or why I was returned while she wasn't. I don't know the purpose behind these abductions or what these beings want from us. All I know is that my life has been irrevocably changed. I can no longer pretend that we're alone in the universe, or that our understanding of reality is complete. Something is out there, something beyond our comprehension, and for reasons I may never understand, it has taken an interest in us. As I write this, I can't shake the feeling that this isn't over. That symbol on my skin, the strange stone, they feel like more than just evidence of what happened. They feel like a message, or perhaps a key to something greater. Whatever the truth may be, I know I can't stop searching for answers, because deep down, I'm certain of one thing: they'll be back. Second story, the Lake Winnipeg Incident, Canada, 1994. It was a crisp winter morning in February 1994 when I decided to head out for some ice fishing on Lake Winnipeg. The air was sharp and biting, but I was used to it. Being a native Manitoban, the cold was practically in my blood. I'd been coming to this spot for years, a secluded area about an hour's drive from my home in Winnipeg. The lake was frozen solid, a vast expanse of white stretching as far as the eye could see. I loaded up my old pickup truck with my gear, my trusty auger, fishing rod, tackle box, and a small portable tent for shelter. As I drove out onto the ice, the familiar crunch of snow under my tires was oddly comforting. I found my usual spot, far from the handful of other fishermen I could see dotting the horizon. It was just me, the ice, and the hope of catching some walleye or northern pike. Little did I know that this routine fishing trip would turn into the most terrifying and inexplicable experience of my life. I set up my tent, drilled a hole through the thick ice, and settled in for what I thought would be a quiet day of fishing. The morning passed uneventfully. I caught a couple of small perch, nothing to write home about, but it was peaceful. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, I noticed the wind picking up, causing the tent to flutter slightly. It was around noon when I first noticed something odd. The wind, which had been a constant background noise all morning, suddenly died down. And I mean completely died down. One moment, there was the soft whistle of air moving across the ice, and the next, nothing. Absolute silence. At first, I didn't think much of it. Weather can be unpredictable, especially out on the lake. But as the silence stretched on, I began to feel uneasy. It wasn't just the wind that had stopped. There was no cracking of ice, no distant shouts from other fishermen. Not even the sound of my own breathing seemed to reach my ears. It was as if someone had hit a cosmic mute button on the world. The silence was so profound that it felt like a physical presence pressing in on me from all sides. I stepped out of my tent, half expecting to see that the world had turned to glass. But everything looked normal, the same vast expanse of white ice, the same pale blue sky. Yet something felt fundamentally wrong. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran down my spine. That's when I heard it, a low, almost subliminal hum. At first, I thought it might be my ears playing tricks on me, compensating for the unnatural silence. But the sound grew stronger, vibrating through the ice beneath my feet. It wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before, not the rumble of distant machinery or the drone of an airplane. This was something else entirely, something that seemed to resonate with my very bones. I spun around, trying to locate the source of the sound, but it seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The hum intensified, building to a pitch that made my teeth ache. And then, without warning, a beam of light shot down from the sky. It was blindingly bright, so intense that I couldn't look directly at it. The beam was focused, like a spotlight, and to my horror, I realized it was centered directly on me. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't respond. It was as if the light itself had weight pinning me in place. The world around me began to blur and distort, the ice and sky melting together into a swirl of white and blue. The last thing I remember is a sensation of weightlessness, of being lifted off my feet. Then everything went black. When I came to, I was no longer on the ice. I found myself lying on a cold, hard surface that felt nothing like the frozen lake. As my vision cleared, I realized I was in some kind of room, if you could call it that. The walls, floor, and ceiling were all made of the same seamless metallic material that seemed to glow with a faint inner light. There were no visible doors or windows, just smooth, curving surfaces that hurt my eyes if I tried to focus on them for too long. The air felt thick and had a strange ozone-like smell that made my nostrils burn. I tried to sit up, but my body wouldn't respond. It wasn't that I was restrained. There were no visible bonds holding me down. It was more like my muscles had simply decided to stop taking orders from my brain. As I lay there, unable to move, unable even to turn my head, I became aware of movement at the edges of my vision. Shapes began to coalesce, forming into figures that approached the table or platform I was lying on. At first, my mind refused to process what I was seeing. They were roughly humanoid in shape, but that's where any resemblance to humans ended. They were tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, and impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed too long and delicate to support their bodies. Their skin was a pale, grayish white that seemed to shimmer slightly, as if it wasn't quite solid. But it was their faces that truly chilled me to my core. They had no mouths, no noses, just enormous almond-shaped black eyes that dominated their elongated heads. Those eyes, they seemed to look through me rather than at me, as if they were examining something beyond my physical form. One of the creatures moved closer, looming over me. I wanted to scream, to thrash, to do anything to get away, but my body remained frozen. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, hear the blood rushing in my ears, but externally I might as well have been a corpse. The being raised one of its hands. I counted 6 long, spindly fingers and reached toward my face. I braced myself for, I don't know what. Pain, a probing touch. But instead a wave of calm washed over me. It wasn't natural. I knew I should be terrified, but it was as if my capacity for fear had been switched off. I felt detached, almost curious, as the creatures began to examine me. Their touch was surprisingly gentle as they ran their fingers along my arms and legs. It felt like being brushed with feathers, but left a tingling sensation in its wake. I couldn't see what they were doing, but I could feel them manipulating my limbs, pressing against my chest and abdomen. There was no pain, but occasionally I'd feel a sharp, cold sensation, like a needle being inserted. Throughout it all, those huge black eyes never left my face. I had the unsettling feeling that they were communicating with each other, even though I couldn't hear anything beyond that persistent, low hum that seemed to permeate the room. Time lost all meaning in that place. It could have been minutes or hours that I lay there subjected to their incomprehensible examination. Eventually, the calm they had imposed on me began to fade, and the terror started to creep back in. As if sensing my growing panic, one of the beings placed its hand on my forehead. The last thing I remember is those bottomless black eyes filling my vision, and then darkness claimed me once again. I jolted awake with a gasp, my heart pounding furiously in my chest. For a moment I was completely disoriented. The metallic room was gone, replaced by the familiar confines of my fishing tent. The silence that had preceded whatever had happened was now broken by the howling wind outside. I sat up abruptly, my head spinning. The floor of the tent was covered in a thin layer of snow that had blown in, and my fishing gear was scattered haphazardly around me. It was as if a small tornado had torn through the space. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my watch. When I looked at it, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. The watch had stopped. The hands were frozen at 2:17 p.m., exactly 2 hours after I'd last checked the time before. Before what? My mind reeled as I tried to make sense of what had happened. Had it all been a dream? Some kind of hallucination brought on by carbon monoxide from my small propane heater? But if that was the case, why was my tent in such disarray? As I struggled to my feet, I noticed something else that sent a wave of panic through me. My boots were missing. I distinctly remembered wearing them. You don't go ice fishing in February without proper footwear. But they were nowhere to be seen. In their place were my old sneakers, which I'd left in the truck as a backup. How had they gotten here? And why were they neatly placed next to my sleeping bag, as if I'd changed into them myself? My confusion only deepened when I realized my heavy winter jacket was on backwards, or rather, inside out. The lining that should have been against my body was now on the outside, the tags clearly visible. I knew with absolute certainty that I hadn't put it on that way. My hands trembled as I took it off and turned it right side out, my mind racing with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. It was then that I noticed the pain in my wrist. At first, I thought I must have slept on it funny, but when I pushed up my sleeve, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, on the pale skin of my inner wrist, was a perfect circle about the size of a dime. It was an angry red, almost like a burn, but with a precision that no accidental burn could achieve. I touched it gingerly, wincing at the sensitivity. It wasn't raised like a blister, but rather seemed to go deep into the tissue as if something had been inserted there. The sight of that mark broke something inside me. Up until that moment, I'd been clinging to the hope that there was some rational explanation for what had happened. But that circular burn was undeniable proof that something had been done to me, something I couldn't explain or understand. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, and I barely made it out of the tent before I was violently sick in the snow. As I knelt there, retching and shivering, the full weight of my experience came crashing down on me. Those creatures with their impossibly large eyes, the metallic room, the examination, it had all been real. I hadn't imagined it or dreamed it. I had been taken, studied like some kind of specimen, and then returned. The realization was almost too much to bear. I don't know how long I stayed there, kneeling in the snow, my mind reeling. Eventually, the biting cold brought me back to my senses. I knew I needed to get off the ice, to get home, to be somewhere that felt safe and normal. With shaking hands, I began to pack up my gear. Every few seconds, I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see that beam of light returning. The wind that had been howling when I woke up had died down again, and the eerie silence that fell over the lake only heightened my paranoia. I worked as quickly as I could, not bothering to properly stow my equipment. I just threw everything haphazardly into the back of my truck, my only thought being to get as far away from this place as possible. The drive home was a blur. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, constantly checking the rearview mirror for... what? Flying saucers? Gray aliens in hot pursuit? A part of me knew how ridiculous that sounded, but after what I'd experienced, nothing seemed impossible anymore. I must have run at least 2 stop signs, but thankfully the roads were nearly empty. It was as if the universe was giving me a clear path home, away from the nightmare I'd just endured. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in the truck for several long minutes, trying to compose myself. How was I supposed to walk into my house and act normal after what had just happened? What would I tell my wife? As I sat there, wrestling with these questions, I caught sight of my reflection in the rearview mirror. I barely recognized myself. My face was pale, my eyes wide and haunted. There was a small cut on my cheek that I didn't remember getting, and my hair looked like I'd stuck my finger in an electrical socket. But it was the expression on my face that truly startled me. A mixture of fear, confusion, and something else. A kind of awe that I couldn't quite explain. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and finally made my way into the house. My wife was in the kitchen preparing dinner. She turned when she heard me come in, a smile on her face that quickly turned to concern when she saw my state. "Mike, what happened? Are you okay?" she asked, rushing over to me. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. How could I possibly explain what had happened when I barely understood it myself? In the end, I mumbled something about falling through some thin ice and getting a scare. It was a weak excuse, and I could tell she didn't fully believe me, but she didn't press the issue. Instead, she led me to the bathroom, helping me out of my damp clothes and into a hot shower. As the hot water cascaded over me, I tried to wash away the lingering feeling of those alien hands on my skin. But no matter how hard I scrubbed, I couldn't shake the sensation of being violated, of having my very being examined and catalogued by those otherworldly creatures. The circular mark on my wrist stood out starkly against my skin, a constant reminder that what had happened was real, not some bizarre hallucination. I must have stood under that shower for an hour, letting the steam fill the bathroom, hoping it would somehow cleanse my mind as well as my body. When I finally emerged, wrapped in a towel and still shaking slightly, I found my wife sitting on the edge of our bed, her face a mask of worry. "Mike," she said softly, "what really happened out there?" I looked at her, this woman who had been my partner for over a decade, and I felt a sudden, overwhelming need to tell her everything. The words came tumbling out in a rush. The unnatural silence, the beam of light, the metallic room, the creatures with their enormous black eyes. As I spoke, I could see the disbelief on her face slowly give way to shock, then fear. When I showed her the mark on my wrist, she gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "We need to go to the hospital," she said when I had finished, her voice trembling slightly. That burn, it needs to be looked at." And maybe they can run some tests. Figure out what... She trailed off, unable to finish the thought, but I shook my head vehemently. The idea of more examinations, more probing, and prodding, even if it was by human doctors, filled me with dread. No, I said firmly. No hospitals, no police, no one can know about this. They'd think I was crazy, or worse, they'd believe me, and then who knows what would happen. I could see the conflict in her eyes, the desire to help me warring with the fear of what might happen if this got out. In the end, she nodded reluctantly, pulling me into a tight embrace. That night was one of the longest of my life. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those alien faces looming over me. The low hum that had filled that strange room seemed to echo in my ears, making it impossible to relax. I tossed and turned, alternating between hot flashes and cold sweats. My wife stayed awake with me, holding my hand, a silent pillar of support, even though I knew she was struggling to process what I'd told her. As the first light of dawn began to filter through our curtains, I finally fell into a fitful sleep, exhausted beyond measure. The next few days passed in a haze of paranoia and confusion. I called in sick to work, unable to face the thought of trying to act normal around my co-workers. My wife, bless her, ran interference with concerned friends and family, telling them I had a bad case of the flu. But while I may have been physically safe in my home, my mind was in constant turmoil. I found myself obsessively checking the mark on my wrist, half expecting it to start glowing or change shape. It remained unchanged, but it refused to fade, a constant reminder of my ordeal. I began to notice other small, unsettling changes. My sense of time seemed to be off. I'd look at the clock, certain only a few minutes had passed, only to find an hour had gone by. I developed a sudden aversion to certain sounds, particularly high-pitched electronic noises that reminded me of that alien hum. The worst was the nightmares. Every night I'd find myself back in that metallic room, paralyzed and helpless as those creatures loomed over me. Sometimes in the dreams, they'd speak to me in a language I couldn't understand, but somehow knew was important. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the alien words fading from my mind before I could grasp them. About a week after the incident, I finally worked up the courage to return to the lake. I told myself it was to retrieve any gear I might have left behind. In my hasty departure, but deep down, I knew I was looking for proof. Proof that what had happened to me was real, that I wasn't losing my mind. My wife begged me not to go, but I insisted I needed to do this. She made me promise to keep my phone on and check in every hour. The drive out to the lake was tense, my knuckles white on the steering wheel as I approached the place where my world had been turned upside down. As I pulled up to the spot where I had been fishing, my heart sank. The ice was unmarked, a pristine expanse of white. There was no sign of the disturbance I had expected to see. No indication that anything out of the ordinary had occurred here. I got out of the truck, my boots crunching in the snow, as I walked to the exact location where my tent had been. Nothing. Not even a depression in the snow where the tent poles had been driven in. It was as if I had never been there at all. Stood there for a long time, the cold wind whipping around me, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew had happened. Had they, whoever or whatever they were, come back and erased all traces of the incident? Or was the lack of evidence itself evidence of how advanced their technology was? As these thoughts swirled in my mind, I noticed something glinting in the snow a few feet away. I trudged over and bent down to examine it. There, half buried in the ice, was one of my missing boots. My heart began to race as I dug it out. It was unmistakably mine, with the same worn treads and the small tear in the side from where I'd caught it on a nail last summer. But something was off. The boot was completely dry despite having supposedly been buried in snow and ice for a week. And when I turned it over, the bottom was pristine, as if it had never touched the ground. I stared at the boot in my hands, a wave of dizziness washing over me. This innocuous piece of footwear somehow made the whole experience more real than anything else. It was tangible proof that something had happened, that I hadn't imagined the whole thing. But it also raised so many questions. Why return just one boot? And why here, a week later? My mind raced with possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. Were they watching me? Was this some kind of message? I scanned the horizon, half expecting to see a UFO hovering in the distance. But there was nothing but the vast expanse of the frozen lake and the cold, clear sky. With shaking hands, I shoved the boot into my truck and climbed back in. As I sat there, engine idling and heater blasting, I felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to flee. This place, which had once been a sanctuary for me, now felt alien and threatening. I peeled out onto the ice, probably driving faster than was safe, desperate to put as much distance between myself and that spot as possible. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every glint of sunlight on the ice, every shadow cast by a passing cloud, seemed to hide potential observers. By the time I made it back to the main road, I was a nervous wreck, jumping at every car that passed me. When I got home, I showed the boot to my wife. She turned it over in her hands, her face a mixture of fear and fascination. "What does it mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head at a loss for words. We spent the rest of the evening in a state of tense silence, both lost in our own thoughts about the implications of this discovery. That night, my dreams were more vivid than ever. I was back in that metallic room, but this time, I could move. The aliens, if that's what they were, stood around me, their large eyes blinking slowly. One of them held my missing boot, turning it over in its long, slender fingers. It seemed to be trying to communicate something to me, but no matter how hard I strained, I couldn't understand. I woke up with a start. The image of those alien hands holding my boot burned into my mind. In the days that followed, I became obsessed with trying to understand what had happened to me. I spent hours online, scouring forums and websites dedicated to UFO sightings and alien abductions. Some of what I read resonated deeply with my experience. The lost time, the strange marks, the lingering psychological effects. But much of it seemed far-fetched, even to me. I found myself growing increasingly frustrated. How could I separate the truth from the conspiracy theories and outright fabrications? And even if I could, what good would it do? It's not like I could go to the authorities with my story. Who would believe me? My wife tried to be supportive, but I could see the toll it was taking on her. She'd watch me with worried eyes as I pored over yet another abduction account or grainy photo purporting to show a UFO. She gently suggested that maybe I should talk to someone, a therapist perhaps, but I brushed off the idea. How could I possibly explain this to a mental health professional without sounding completely insane? Besides, I was afraid of what might happen if word of my experience got out. Would I become a laughingstock? Or worse, would shadowy government agents show up at our door, demanding to know what I'd seen? As weeks turned into months, the physical evidence of my encounter began to fade. The circular mark on my wrist gradually disappeared, leaving behind only the faintest discoloration that you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. But the psychological scars remained. I found myself struggling with insomnia, jumping at unexpected noises, and battling a constant low-level anxiety that never seemed to fully dissipate. I'd catch myself staring at the night sky, searching for something. A sign, maybe, or a warning. My wife did her best to help me through it, but I could see the strain it was putting on our relationship. How do you move forward when your entire understanding of reality has been shattered? It was about 6 months after the incident when things took another strange turn. I was at work, trying to focus on a project deadline, when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. My heart nearly stopped when I read the message. "We know what you saw. Meet us at the lake. Tonight. Midnight." I stared at the screen, my mind reeling. Who was this? How did they know? And more importantly, what should I do? Part of me wanted to ignore it, to delete the message and pretend it never happened. But a larger part, the part that had been desperate for answers these past months, knew I had to go. I made an excuse to my wife about working late and drove out to the lake, my stomach churning with a mixture of fear and anticipation. As I approached the spot where it had all happened, I saw a figure standing at the edge of the ice. For a moment, my heart leapt into my throat, thinking it might be one of them. But as I got closer, I realized it was just a man. Middle-aged, slightly overweight, wearing a parka and thick glasses. He introduced himself as Dr. Alan Hynek, a name I would later learn belonged to a famous UFO researcher who had died years earlier, and claimed to be part of a secret government task force investigating extraterrestrial encounters. What followed was one of the most surreal conversations of my life. Dr. Hynek, if that was really his name, seemed to know details about my experience that I hadn't told anyone, not even my wife. He spoke of other cases similar to mine, of a pattern of abductions and returned objects. When I showed him the boot I'd found, he nodded as if it confirmed something he already knew. "They're studying us," he said, his voice low and intense, "learning our behaviors, our patterns. The returned objects are part of their experiment." I listened, alternating between skepticism and a desperate desire to believe that someone finally understood what I'd been through. As Dr. Hynek continued to speak, the ice beneath our feet seemed to groan and shift, as if responding to the weight of the secrets being shared. He told me about other abductees he'd worked with, people who had experienced similar phenomena and struggled with the aftermath. According to him, the government had been aware of these incidents for decades, but kept them hidden from the public to prevent panic. I wanted to believe him, to feel like I wasn't alone in this. But something felt off. Maybe it was the way his eyes never quite met mine, or the slight tremor in his hand as he gestured emphatically. Whatever it was, a seed of doubt had been planted in my mind. "We can help you," he said, leaning in close. "We have resources, technology that can unlock the memories of your experience, help you understand what really happened." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "Call this number when you're ready, but remember, discretion is paramount. Your safety, and the safety of those you love, depends on your silence." With that ominous warning, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness beyond the reach of my headlights. I stood there for a long time after he left, The business card clutched in my trembling hand, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and conflicting emotions. The drive home was a blur. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, trying to make sense of it all. Part of me was elated at the prospect of finally getting answers, of having my experience validated by someone who seemed to know what they were talking about. But another part, a more rational part, was setting off alarm bells. How had this man found me? Why meet in secret if he was really part of a government task force? And that name, Alan Hynek. Why use the name of a deceased UFO researcher? By the time I pulled into my driveway, I was no closer to deciding what to do. I didn't tell my wife about the meeting. I told myself it was to protect her, to keep her from worrying. But deep down I knew it was because I was afraid she'd talk me out of pursuing it further. For the next few days, I carried that business card around like a talisman, taking it out when I was alone to stare at the nondescript phone number printed on it. I'd pick up my phone, finger hovering over the keypad, only to set it down again. Something was holding me back, a nagging feeling that once I made that call, there would be no going back. It was on the third night after meeting Dr. Hynek that things came to a head. I was tossing and turning in bed, the events of the past, months swirling through my mind when suddenly I felt it. That same bone-deep hum I'd experienced on the lake. My whole body tensed, eyes flying open to scan the darkened bedroom. There, at the foot of the bed, was a shimmer in the air like heat rising from pavement on a hot day. As I watched, paralyzed with fear, the shimmer coalesced into a familiar shape, tall, thin, with those enormous black eyes that had haunted my dreams for months. I tried to scream, to wake my wife, to do anything, but my body wouldn't respond. It was just like that day on the lake, complete paralysis. The being moved closer, its movements fluid and unnatural. It raised a hand, those impossibly long fingers reaching towards my face. I braced myself, expecting, I don't know what. Pain? Another abduction? But instead, as those fingers brushed against my forehead, I felt a sudden rush of understanding. Images flashed through my mind. Stars, galaxies, strange worlds. I saw myself from the outside, lying on that metal table, but now I could sense the curiosity, the genuine desire for knowledge that drove these beings. There was no malice, no sinister intent, just an overwhelming thirst to understand. As quickly as it had appeared, the alien vanished, leaving me gasping for air in the darkness of my bedroom. My wife stirred beside me, mumbling sleepily, "Mike, are you okay?" I couldn't answer. How could I possibly explain what had just happened? As the adrenaline began to fade, I was left with a profound sense of peace. For the first time since my abduction, the constant anxiety that had been my companion these past months was gone. In its place was a certainty, a bone-deep knowledge that what had happened to me was part of something much larger, much more important than I could have ever imagined. In the light of day, I might have dismissed it all as an incredibly vivid dream. But when I got up to use the bathroom, I caught sight of myself in the mirror and froze. There on my forehead, where the alien's fingers had touched, was a faint, iridescent mark, like oil on water. It faded even as I watched, disappearing completely within minutes. But it was enough. Enough to convince me that what I'd experienced was real, and enough to make me realize what I needed to do next. I took out the business card Dr. Hynek had given me and without hesitation ripped it to shreds. Whatever game he and his supposed task force were playing, I wanted no part of it. The aliens, if that's what they truly were, had chosen to communicate with me directly. They had shown me glimpses of a universe far vaster and more wondrous than I had ever imagined. And while I still had 1,000 questions, I no longer felt the desperate need to have them all answered immediately. I understood now that some mysteries are meant to unfold slowly, in their own time. In the months and years that followed, I gradually came to terms with my experience. I never saw the aliens again, at least not in any way I could definitively prove. But I felt their presence in subtle ways, in the way the stars seemed brighter on clear nights, in the moments of unexpected clarity that would come to me when I least expected it. I still had nightmares occasionally, still felt a twinge of unease when I heard certain sounds or saw certain patterns of light. But the paralyzing fear that had gripped me in the aftermath of my abduction was gone, replaced by a sense of wonder at the vastness of the universe and our place in it. I never went back to ice fishing. Some experiences change you too fundamentally to ever fully return to your old life. But I did start taking my kids camping, teaching them to look up at the night sky with open minds and hearts. I told them stories, not of my abduction, they were too young for that, but of the possibilities that exist beyond our world. And sometimes, when the night was especially clear and the stars seemed close enough to touch, I'd feel that familiar hum deep in my bones. In those moments, I'd smile to myself, knowing that somewhere out there, those beings were continuing their exploration, their quest for understanding. I still don't know why they chose me that day on the lake. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened or what it all means. But I've come to accept that not knowing is okay. Some experiences defy explanation, existing in that blurry space between the known and the unknown. My encounter with beings from another world, or perhaps another dimension, taught me that the universe is far stranger and more magnificent than we can possibly imagine. And while that knowledge can be terrifying, it's also incredibly liberating. Because in a universe that vast, that full of possibilities, anything can happen. Even to an ordinary guy on a frozen lake in the middle of nowhere. Third story, Lights in the Frozen Night, Russia, 2010. It was a frigid Siberian night, the kind where your breath freezes before it even leaves your mouth. I'd been driving my cargo truck for hours, the endless stretch of highway before me barely visible in the weak glow of my headlights. The darkness out here was oppressive, seeming to press in on all sides of my vehicle. I'd made this run countless times before, but something felt different tonight. Maybe it was the way the stars seemed to flicker more intensely than usual, or how the shadows at the edge of the forest seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I tried to shake off the feeling, chalking it up to too many hours on the road and not enough sleep. I reached for the radio, hoping some music would help keep me alert. That's when it happened. A high-pitched whine erupted from the speakers, so sudden and piercing that I nearly swerved off the road. It wasn't static or interference. This sound was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It seemed to drill into my skull, setting my teeth on edge and making the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I fumbled with the dial, trying to turn it off, but the noise only intensified. And then, as abruptly as it had started, everything went silent. Not just the radio, everything. The rumble of the engine, the hum of the tires on the asphalt, even the usual creaks and groans of the truck. All of it vanished in an instant. I felt a moment of vertigo as the truck began to slow, coasting to a stop in the middle of the empty highway. Panic gripped me as I realized that the truck had completely lost power. The dashboard was dark, the headlights extinguished, plunging me into near-total darkness. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white as my eyes struggled to adjust to the sudden blackness. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was a hallucination, a trick of my tired eyes. But as I blinked and squinted, the image before me only became clearer and more terrifying. Hovering just above the road ahead was a glowing sphere, perfectly round and utterly silent. It cast an eerie, pulsating light that seemed to drain the color from everything it touched. The sphere was massive, easily the size of a house, and it hung there impossibly, defying gravity and logic. I tried to move, to open the door, to shout, to do anything, but my body wouldn't respond. It was like I was frozen in place, a prisoner in my own skin. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, hear the blood rushing in my ears, but I couldn't so much as twitch a finger. The light from the sphere began to intensify, growing brighter and brighter until it was painfully white. I wanted to close my eyes, to look away, but I couldn't. I was forced to stare directly into that impossible light as it consumed everything around me. Time seemed to lose all meaning. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed as the light enveloped me. It could have been seconds or hours. The next thing I became aware of was the biting cold against my face. I blinked, disoriented, to find myself standing outside my truck. The sphere was gone, and the night was once again dark and still. But something was terribly wrong. My body felt different, off somehow, in a way I couldn't quite explain. My limbs were heavy and clumsy, as if I was moving through molasses. And there was a dull ache throughout my entire body, centered most strongly in my chest. I stumbled to the side of the road, my legs barely cooperating, and retched into the snow. As I straightened up, wiping my mouth with a shaking hand, I caught sight of my watch. My blood ran cold as I realized that over 3 hours had passed since I'd last checked the time. 3 hours that were completely blank in my memory. What had happened during that lost time? I didn't want to think about it, but my mind raced with terrifying possibilities. I forced myself to take deep breaths, trying to calm the panic that threatened to overwhelm me. That's when I noticed something else. A series of strange, perfectly triangular marks on my chest, visible through the gaps in my partially unbuttoned shirt. They were red and slightly raised, almost like brands, forming a precise geometric pattern. I traced them with trembling fingers, a sick feeling growing in the pit of my stomach. These marks hadn't been there before, I was certain of that. I stumbled back to the truck, my mind reeling from what had just happened. The bitter Siberian wind whipped around me, but I barely felt it. My entire body was numb, and not just from the cold. As I climbed back into the cab, I noticed something else that sent a fresh wave of fear through me. The truck's electrical system was completely fried. The dashboard was a mess of blown fuses and melted wiring. It looked like it had been struck by lightning, but there hadn't been a cloud in the sky. I tried the radio again, desperate for some connection to the outside world, but it was dead, silent, useless. I slumped in my seat, the reality of my situation slowly sinking in. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, in one of the most inhospitable regions on Earth, with no way to call for help. And that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the gnawing uncertainty, the gaping hole in my memory, and the terrifying possibility of what might have happened during those missing hours. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, peering into the darkness beyond the windows. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that whatever had been out there, whatever had done this to me, was still nearby, waiting, observing. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just paranoia and the effects of shock. But deep down I knew something had fundamentally changed. The world felt different now, as if a veil had been lifted, revealing a reality I was never meant to see. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, I made a decision. I couldn't stay here. Even if the truck was dead, I had to move. Sitting still felt too vulnerable, too exposed. I grabbed what supplies I could, some water, a few energy bars, and a flashlight, and set out on foot along the highway. Every step was an effort. My body felt wrong, alien, as if it didn't quite fit me anymore. And those marks on my chest, they seemed to pulse with a dull heat, a constant reminder of what I'd experienced. As I walked, I tried to piece together what had happened. The sphere, the light, the missing time. It all pointed to one conclusion, as impossible as it seemed. Alien abduction. The words felt ridiculous even thinking them, like something out of a bad sci-fi movie. But what else could explain it? The rational part of my brain rebelled against the idea, desperately searching for some other explanation. Maybe I'd had some kind of seizure or mental break. Maybe I'd been drugged somehow. But none of those explanations felt right. They couldn't account for the physical evidence, the fried truck, the strange marks, the lost time. No, as much as I wanted to deny it, I knew in my gut that something truly extraordinary and terrifying had occurred. As I trudged along the empty highway, the sun slowly climbed higher in the sky. The familiar Siberian landscape should have been comforting, but now it felt alien and threatening. Every rustle in the underbrush, every shadow cast by the trees, made me flinch. I found myself constantly looking up at the sky, half expecting to see that glowing sphere return. But there was nothing except the vast, empty blue. Hours passed, and my body ached with exhaustion. I was about to give up hope of finding any help when I spotted a glint of metal in the distance. As I got closer, I realized it was another truck, pulled over on the side of the road. Relief flooded through me at the sight of another human being. The driver, a grizzled old man with a thick beard, looked at me with concern as I approached. I must have been quite a sight, disheveled, wild-eyed, covered in a light frost. When I tried to explain what had happened, my words came out in a jumbled rush. I could see the disbelief and then the pity in his eyes. He clearly thought I was crazy or on drugs, but he was kind enough to offer me a ride to the next town. As we drove, I caught him glancing at me nervously every few minutes. I wanted to tell him that I wasn't dangerous, that I was just as frightened and confused as I must have appeared. But I remained silent, lost in my own thoughts. What would I do now? Who could I tell about what had happened? Would anyone believe me? And more importantly, would it happen again? The town we arrived in was a small, nondescript place, the kind of remote Siberian settlement that seems forgotten by time. As the old truck driver dropped me off near the local police station, I could feel the curious stares of the townspeople. I must have looked like a complete wreck. My clothes were rumpled and dirty, my hair a wild mess, and my eyes, well, I Can only imagine how crazed and haunted they must have appeared. I stumbled into the police station, the warmth inside a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. The officer at the desk looked up at me with a mixture of concern and wariness. I tried to explain what had happened, but the words sounded insane even to my own ears. Glowing spheres, missing time, strange marks. I could see the skepticism growing in the officer's eyes with each passing moment. He listened patiently, but I could tell he didn't believe a word of it. In the end, he suggested I get some rest and offered to put me up in a small room they kept for stranded travelers. I wanted to protest, to make him understand the gravity of what had happened, but exhaustion was quickly overtaking me. I nodded mutely and followed him to the tiny, sparse room. As I lay on the narrow cot, staring at the cracked ceiling, sleep evaded me despite my bone-deep weariness. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that pulsating sphere of light. I could feel phantom sensations crawling across my skin, as if invisible hands were still examining me. The marks on my chest seemed to throb in time with my racing heartbeat. I don't know how long I lay there, trapped in a limbo between waking and sleeping, before I finally drifted off. The dreams that came were vivid and terrifying. I was back, in that sphere of light. But this time I could see shapes moving just beyond the brightness, tall, impossibly thin figures with large black eyes. They moved with an unsettling grace, their long fingers reaching for me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I jerked awake, drenched in sweat, my throat raw as if I had been screaming after all. Sunlight was streaming through the small window, and for a moment I felt a surge of relief. It had just been a nightmare. But as I sat up, I felt something shift under my shirt. With trembling hands, I unbuttoned it and looked down at my chest. The triangular marks were still there, angry and red against my pale skin. It hadn't been a dream. It had all been real. Over the next few days, I tried to piece my life back together. The local police helped me file a report about my abandoned truck, but I could tell they didn't take my story seriously. They hinted at drunk driving or falling asleep at the wheel, clearly preferring mundane explanations to the impossible truth. I called my employer, fumbling through an explanation about mechanical troubles and getting stranded. They weren't happy, but at least I still had a job to go back to. Eventually. But how could I go back to normal life after what I'd experienced? The world felt different now, as if a fundamental truth had been revealed to me that I couldn't unknow. I found myself jumping at shadows, constantly scanning the skies. Sleep became a luxury, plagued as I was by vivid nightmares that left me gasping and disoriented. The marks on my chest faded slowly, but never completely disappeared. They remained as a constant reminder, a physical link to that inexplicable night. I began to notice other changes too. Sometimes I would get flashes of information or knowledge that I couldn't explain. Complex mathematical equations that suddenly made sense, or brief glimpses of places I'd never been. These moments were fleeting, but intense, leaving me dizzy and confused. Was this some side effect of whatever had been done to me? Or was my mind simply cracking under the strain of what I'd been through? As the days turned into weeks, I found myself unable to leave the small Siberian town. Something kept me tethered there, a mix of fear and an inexplicable feeling that I needed to stay close to where it had happened. I took odd jobs to support myself, but I was a shell of my former self. The locals regarded me with a mixture of pity and suspicion, whispering about the mad truck driver when they thought I couldn't hear. But I didn't care about their judgment. My mind was consumed with trying to understand what had happened to me. I spent countless hours in the local library, poring over any books I could find on UFOs, alien abductions, and unexplained phenomena. Most of it seemed like nonsense, but occasionally I'd come across an account that eerily mirrored my own experience. It was both comforting and terrifying to know that I wasn't alone in this. One night, about a month after my encounter, I was walking back to my rented room when I felt a sudden, intense pressure in my head. It was like someone had placed a vice around my skull and was slowly tightening it. I stumbled, leaning against a nearby wall for support. That's when I saw it. A series of symbols and images flashing before my eyes, too fast for me to comprehend. It lasted only seconds, but when it was over, I was left with a profound sense of unease. Something was coming. I didn't know what or when, but I could feel it in my bones. The feeling of impending something grew stronger with each passing day. I found myself drawn to the outskirts of town, to the road where I'd left my truck that fateful night. I'd stand there for hours, staring at the sky, waiting for a sign. The locals began to avoid me entirely, crossing the street when they saw me coming. I couldn't blame them. I knew how I must have looked, wild-eyed, unkempt, muttering to myself. But I couldn't shake the certainty that I needed to be ready, that something was about to happen. It was on one of these vigils, about 6 weeks after my encounter, that I saw it again. At first I thought it was a star, brighter than the others. But then it began to move, slowly at first, then with impossible speed. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched the glowing sphere dance across the night sky. Part of me wanted to run, to hide, to pretend I hadn't seen anything. But a larger part, a part I didn't fully understand, felt an inexorable pull towards the light. Without consciously deciding to, I began to walk towards it, my feet carrying me off the road and into the dense Siberian forest. The sphere seemed to retreat as I approached, always staying just out of reach. I don't know how long I walked, pushing through the underbrush, branches scratching at my face and arms. Time seemed to lose all meaning once again. Suddenly I found myself in a large clearing that I was certain hadn't been there before. The trees around the edge seemed too perfectly arranged, too symmetrical to be natural, and in the center of the clearing hovered the sphere, pulsing with that same otherworldly light I remembered from that night on the highway. I should have been terrified, but instead I felt an eerie calm wash over me. As I stood there, rooted to the spot, the sphere began to descend. It touched the ground with a soft hiss, and a seam appeared in its smooth surface. A doorway opened, spilling more of that brilliant light onto the forest floor. And then I saw them. The beings from my nightmares, tall and impossibly thin, with large dark eyes that seemed to peer into my very soul. They emerged from the sphere with fluid grace, moving towards me with slow, deliberate steps. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but my body wouldn't respond. As they reached out to me with their long, slender fingers, I felt that same paralysis from the night of my abduction take hold. The last thing I remember is those eyes, so alien and yet somehow familiar, staring into mine as the world around me faded to white. I came to with a jolt, finding myself sprawled on the forest floor. The clearing was gone, replaced by the dense, familiar Siberian woods. Sunlight filtered through the canopy above, suggesting that hours had passed. My head throbbed, and my body ached as if I'd run a marathon. As I struggled to sit up, I noticed something clutched tightly in my right hand. It was a small metallic object, about the size of a coin, with intricate symbols etched into its surface. Symbols that looked eerily similar to the ones I'd seen, flashing before my eyes weeks earlier. I stared at it, my mind reeling. Was this proof? Had it really happened again? Or was I simply losing my grip on reality? I pocketed the object, not sure what else to do, and began the long trek back to town. My clothes were torn and dirty, and I was covered in scratches from pushing through the underbrush. As I emerged from the forest onto the main road, I caught sight of my reflection in a puddle. I hardly recognized myself. My eyes were wild, my hair matted with leaves and twigs, but it was the expression on my face that truly frightened me. A mixture of awe, terror, and something else. Something that looked unsettlingly like anticipation. The town was in an uproar when I returned. Apparently, I'd been missing for 3 days. Search parties had been sent out, and there was talk of calling in specialized teams from the larger cities. When I stumbled into the police station, the same officer who had taken my initial report looked at me with a mixture of relief and suspicion. I tried to explain where I'd been, but the words wouldn't come. How could I describe what had happened when I wasn't even sure myself? In the end, I mumbled something about getting lost in the woods, too embarrassed to admit I'd been searching for UFOs. The officer didn't seem convinced, but he was clearly relieved to have me back alive. As he took my statement, I could feel the weight of the strange metal object in my pocket. I wanted to show it to him, to have someone else confirm its existence, but something held me back. A voice in the back of my mind whispered that it wasn't time yet, that I needed to keep it secret. After answering what felt like endless questions and enduring a thorough medical examination, which thankfully revealed no new mysterious marks, I was finally allowed to return to my rented room. As I lay in bed that night, turning the metal object over and over in my hands, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and mounting paranoia. I became obsessed with the metal object, spending hours studying its intricate symbols, trying to decipher their meaning. Sometimes, when I held it just right, I swore I could feel it vibrate slightly, as if it were alive. I started having vivid dreams, or were they memories, of my time in the sphere. Flashes of strange machines, of tests being performed, of knowledge being poured directly into my brain. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my head pounding with information I couldn't quite grasp. The townspeople, already wary of me before, now treated me like a pariah. Whispers followed me wherever I went. Some thought I was a drunk or a drug addict. Others, perhaps more unsettling, began to look at me with a kind of fearful reverence. I overheard murmurs about the chosen one and signs from above. It was all too much. I knew I couldn't stay in this town any longer. Whatever was happening to me, whatever I was becoming, I needed answers. And I had a feeling those answers weren't going to be found in this small Siberian village. One night, about a week after my return from the forest, I packed a small bag with some clothes and what little money I had. I slipped the metal object into my pocket, its weight now as familiar as my own heartbeat. As I stepped out into the cool night air, I took one last look at the starry sky above. Somewhere up there were the beings who had changed my life forever. And somehow, I knew our paths would cross again. It's been years since that night on the Siberian highway, years since I left that small town behind. I've traveled across continents, searching for others who have had similar experiences, looking for any clue that might help me understand what happened to me. The metal object remains my constant companion, a tangible link to that other world. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I swear I can hear it calling to me in a language I almost understand. I've learned to live with the knowledge that I'll probably never have all the answers. The nightmares have faded, replaced by a sort of bittersweet acceptance, but I can never fully shake the feeling of being watched, of being part of something larger than myself. Every time I see a bright light in the sky, my heart races with a mixture of fear and longing, because deep down, in a place I rarely admit exists, part of me hopes they'll come back. Part of me wants to see what's on the other side of that glowing doorway. So I keep watching the skies, waiting, because I know now that we're not alone in this universe. And for better or worse, they know about us too. Whatever happens next, I'll be ready. Or at least as ready as anyone can be when facing the unknown.